Բարև ձեզ հարգելի բարեկամներ, Սփյուռքի ձայնը հեռուստահանդեսը դարձյալ ձեզ հետ է։ Վերջերս լույս տեսավ ամերիկահայ արձակագիր, New York Times bestseller հեղինակ Chris Bihjaliani «Ավազե ամրոցի աղջիկները» գիրքը։ Chris Bihjaliանը այս օրերի շրջում է Միացյալ Նահանգներով եւ հանդիպումներ ունենում իր ընթերցողների, ինչպես նաեւ հայ համայնքի անդամների հետ։ Այդպիսի մի հանդիպում վերջերս տեղի ունեցավ Նյու Յորքում, որի ժամանակ մենք հարցազրույց ունեցանք հեղինակի հետ, որն այժմ սիրով ուզում եմ ներկայացնել ձեր ուշադրությանը։
Last week at the Lighthouse International in New York City took place a presentation and book signing of the New York Times best-selling author Chris Bihjalian. This event was part of his national book tour for his new book, The Sandcastle Girls, which now recently is on the New York Times bestseller list. The evening was presented by ANC New York and Doubleday Publishing and was hosted by the AGBU Ararat and co-sponsored by the AGBU Young Professionals of Greater New York, as well as the Armenian Network New York region, AYF YOARF New York, the Hayortik chapter, and Hamaskain of New York. The evening opened with welcoming remarks from AGBU's Associate Education Director, Natalie Gabrielian, followed by ANCA Representative Ani Chaglazian, who introduced Chris Bihjalian. Chris Bihjalian's engaging presentation included a slideshow, then followed by Q&A from the audience.
Our guest today is Chris Bihjalian, a New York Times best-selling author, novelist of the books Midwives and Skeletons at the Feast. And he is now with the new book, The Sandcastle Girls. Thank you very much for doing this interview.
Oh, my goodness gracious. I thank you so much for your faith in my work and letting me join you for a minute.
The book tells a story in two times, in modern times New York and in 1915 Aleppo. Why do you decide to create a structure like that?
Sure. The reason why the book moves back and forth in time between 2012 and 1915 is because I knew that so much of my audience was going to be unfamiliar with the Armenian genocide. So much so that my narrator, a female version of me named Laura Petrosian, christens the slaughter you know next to nothing about. By moving back and forth in time between 2012 and an innermost ring of Dante's Inferno, Aleppo, and Deir el-Zor, Syria in 1915, I'm able to educate readers about the Armenian genocide, to present the tragedy, the extermination, the annihilation in a fashion that isn't a history textbook, but is instead presented by a narrator who's part of the story and who they care about. It also allows me to create a detective story. Laura Petrosian, in the present, realizes that her grandparents, one of whom is a genocide survivor, one of whom is a genocide witness, like so many genocide survivors, took their secrets to their graves. They didn't share the worst of what they experienced or what they endured with their children and not with their grandchildren. But in the present, when Laura comes across a photograph at the Armenian Library and Museum of America in Watertown, she realizes it's the window into her grandparents' story and, for readers, going back to your question, the Armenian genocide.
You said that Laura Petrosian in many ways represents you. I also did, when I was doing some research on this book, I've read a quote from you that said most of your adult life you've been contemplating to write a book about Armenian genocide. What made you make that decision? What drove you to write this book?
Sure. The Sandcastle Girls is actually the second time that I've tried to write about the Armenian genocide. The first time was in 1993, and in fact, I finished the book. It's a terrible, terrible book, however. When I look back on it, I like to view it as merely apprentice work, but I know in my heart that it's actually amateurish work. And so that manuscript only exists in the archives of my alma mater, Amherst College in Western Massachusetts. Why did I try again 17 years later in 2010? Well, first of all, because the story is so important. We know there's a direct link between the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, the Cambodian killing fields, Bosnia, Serbia, Rwanda, Darfur. Secondly, while the Western eyes were once turned upon the eastern edges of the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian genocide, by 1939 it had receded so far into the mists of history that before unleashing his panzers on Poland, Hitler, as we know, ordered his commanders, be merciless. Be merciless. After all, who today remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? And so, with 2015, the centennial nearing, it seemed critical to try again now. 10 books later, 17 years older, and finally, when a good friend of mine, Hachuk Muradian, the editor of the Armenian Weekly, said to me, "When are you going to try again?" I knew I had a moral obligation to dig down and get this story right.
I'm curious about the creative process of this book because, in essence, you're weaving a tragic history of Armenians living in Turkey in 1915 and a fictional story that engages the audience and makes it an interesting book to read. By doing so, we are also engaging non-Armenians to closer understand the history of Armenian genocide. What was your creative process? How long it took for you to write this book, and what was your creative process composing this story and putting it together?
Sure. I started the book in 2010, and it was finished essentially by August of 2011. So like most of my books, it took a little longer than a year to write. The process that was different this time from in the past is my emotional involvement with the characters. I've written 15 books. I'm supposed to be a jaded, cynical, middle-aged novelist. But the reality is that I have never cared so deeply about the women and men in any of my books as I do Hatun, Nevart, Karin, Armen, and Elizabeth. I was worried every time I was writing a scene with little Hatun in it. Hatun is an 8-year-old orphan. Yep, she's an 8-year-old orphan who struggles into Aleppo after having witnessed literally the beheading of her older sister and her mother by gendarmes in the desert. And when I finished this book, I was filled with a postpartum sadness that left me staggered.
It's indeed an emotional book, and I would imagine that it would be impossible for you to write this book without having an emotional connection to the characters. My next question to you is a broader question. How was it received by the audience, by Armenian audience, or readers, I should say, Armenian readers, non-Armenian readers, and specifically if you had any feedback from Turkish readers?
Sure. There are 3 parts to this question. First of all, I am blown away by the wonderful reception of the Armenian American community to this book. They have embraced it, they have embraced me, and taken me under their wing, and I am grateful beyond words. Readers who are not Armenian, I'm so thrilled, are falling in love with characters like Nevart and Hatun and Elizabeth, and I'm so glad. But this is very interesting. They are also saying over and over, how did I grow up and never hear this story? Why did no one ever tell me that 1.5 million Armenians were systematically slaughtered in the First World War? How did I grow up and not know this story? And that, too, is an important role this book can play, I hope, in our culture. As for Turkish readers, I've not heard from any directly. I have seen their comments at the bottom of the reviews in the Washington Post, in USA Today, and the Miami Herald, with some of the usual fabrications and denials that we hear all too often. You know, the Armenians were slaughtering Muslims. The Armenians were a 5th column helping the Russians. More Muslims than Armenians died. And my favorite, the Armenians were responsible for the Holocaust.
I haven't heard that one. But
look at some of the Miami Herald.
Yes, I'm going to. My final question, what would you like your readers to walk away with after reading this book?
You know, I hope they walk away closing the book filled with both the greater knowledge of the Armenian genocide and with hope. This book is also about hope. It's a love story. It's a big, sweeping love story. And I love historical love stories like Atonement and The English Patient and Corelli's Mandolin. And those were books that were so instrumental to my thinking when I was writing this book. When I close the book, when readers close the book, I hope they are just so happy that they've read it and they've spent a few days with these characters.
I want to thank you for writing this book, for bringing these very important historical facts into the light and packaging into this beautiful, entertaining novel. Thank you so much.
Oh, Heike, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure.
My pleasure.